All right, all right. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate the organizers of the event, of course, for inviting me to be a part of this. To quote another rapper, it's getting hot in here. I gotta sorry, I had to do it, but it is. I appreciate my students, many who are current, some of whom are former, who came through for this. So I wanted to maybe pick up and on what Charis was talking about, and I think she touched on some of the issues that I might be delving into. And what I want to do is kind of maybe throw out some provocations. I come from film and media studies, the soft sciences, if you want to call it that. And despite my film and media studies pedigree, if you will, there's going to be no audio-visual stuff for you. I figured I could have shown a video or two or a sound clip or two that may have helped amplify some of the points I'm trying to make, but hopefully enough of you are familiar with what I'm going to talk about, and if not, you'll go in and research maybe some of the songs that I might mention in particular. So I wanted to start the conversation. I mean, this is an event called Rap on Trial, and I wanted to start by invoking the person known as H. Rap Brown, who today sits in a federal supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. His legal name is Jamil Al-Amin, and maybe many of you know him as H. Rap Brown, former member of the Black Panthers and SNCC, who's now imprisoned, like I said, in Florida after being convicted in Georgia, but moved to Florida, the federal supermax, what's called the domestic Guantanamo, where the highest security threats of the country are held. And his kind of incarceration there, in many ways, speaks to the continuing legacy of policing and surveillance and even incarceration of Black protest. And I invoke H. Rap Brown for many reasons. Obviously, the moniker rap, right, for his ability to move crowds, raise kind of a critical consciousness, in many ways was the precursor to hip hop music itself. And so it's important to understand the connection, hopefully, not just between hip hop music as we know it today and its relationship to the Black Power movements or the Black Arts movement before it, but a kind of more historical, if you will, legacy of Black artistic protest that has continued to be policed and surveilled, whether it be slave songs and spirituals to jazz, R&B, which you all now know is rock and roll, and I'm sure my students who took my hip hop class understand the difference, hopefully. Right, Diego? All right. Right, R&B, and then on into hip hop, right? That there's been a kind of enduring suspicion around kind of Black creative impulse in this country, particularly in its connection to Black protest and the Black protest tradition. And hip hop in many ways fits neatly within that, very perfectly within that. And so in order for us to understand what it means for lyrics to be admitted into court, right? And the kind of complexities around what that's about. And Charis pointed out many of them already, and I'm sure Dean Chemerinsky is going to point out more as well. But in order to understand the complexities of these debates, we have to understand hip hop, not in terms of this, kind of like I said, shorter history of policing and surveillance, but also the longer history of policing and surveillance, not just upon Black protest and Black cultural practice, but Black bodies themselves, right? It's ironic that too many people today who claim to like hip hop music really don't like Black people. There's like a separation between the music and the people. I like the music, but then you start getting into kind of conversations and there's a kind of, you begin to hear things, right? Whereas those who want to condemn rap music equate it with Black people. They see them as one and the same. So that to talk about hip hop, to talk about rap music in many ways is a dog whistle way, if you will, about talking about Black people when you condemn them. You make comments about hip hop, you're really talking about Black people, right? It's dog whistle speak, so this, And so what I want to try and do is in trying to talk about this history of policing and surveillance, right? It's important to understand the presumption of guilt, the presumption of suspicion that surrounds Black bodies already, before they even get in the courtroom. In fact, that's more often times they either get into the courtroom or the coffin, is because of the presumption of suspicion and guilt, right? And so we have to keep this in mind that, as the critical race studies scholars pointed out to us, and I want to talk about this toward the end of my talk, right? We have to understand how race is structured within the very fabric of American society so that it informs the legal codes. They're not separate or distinct. The law is not some sort of panacea or kind of utopic space upon which justice is going to be served. It's deeply informed by understandings and assumptions around race and white supremacy. We have to keep that in mind. So in many ways, sometimes the question about the admissibility of lyrics becomes a red herring. It becomes a red herring. It takes us away from a larger and broader and more systemic conversation about how white supremacy is operating. And so I want us to keep that in mind, right? And again, I'm throwing out provocations that hopefully we can kind of like unpack in a Q&A, but let's keep that in mind. Now, Sheris kind of began to gesture toward this, and I talk about this in my hip hop class when I teach it. It's important for us to understand also that what is the relationship between art and the human? I mean, historically within the West, right? I mean, there's this notion that art is in Matthew Arnold's conception of art, right? It's the best that's thought and said in a culture, right? So there's these pedigreed forms of culture, the novel. I'm in film and media studies. We fought real hard to make film part of that tradition. So now it's film too, right? But the novel, painting, right? In particular forms, in particular ways. But the novel and film are kind of these pedigreed and kind of accepted, it's not celebrated forms of artistic practice, right? Hip hop obviously is not. It's not seen as part of that tradition, right? Why is that, right? And part of what I want to talk about is the way in which the very concept of the human was constructed, right? That is to say, those who were non-European and non-white were seen as non-human in different ways, right? So that the art they created was not universal. Instead, it was specific and particular or parochial. So there was black art, a black artist couldn't create universal art. It spoke to particular subjective, parochial, or particular experiences. It's not accepted within the canon of what's considered art, right? And you had these debates. I mean, Langston Hughes, the Negro artist in the Racial Mountain, in 1926, he's talking about this problematic, right? But this haunts even the study of the novel itself. For all you comp lit heads in here, you know, right? What is celebrated and accepted as a legitimate kind of novel, and then the other novels that are created, even though the novel itself is accepted as a form of art. But when you're talking about a genre like hip hop that is categorically existing outside the boundaries of what is acceptable cultural production or acceptable art, right? It takes on a whole different contour, and this is, partly what I want to kind of gesture toward. Because what's important to understand, and Sheris pointed out, is just like the novel did, just like black artists who used the novel and the white novelists who continue to use the novel, right? The ideas around allegory and metaphor, right? Voice and embodiment, right? Genre conventions, all those things you can see happening in hip hop, right? This notion that hip hop is somehow literal or autobiographical is part of a longer tradition of undermining the humanity it seeks to claim, right? By assuming that it's only literal and it's only autobiographical, that it can't be creative. The people who write this music, they're not smart enough to use allegory and metaphor. That takes abstraction. That's not possible with those people, right? So there's a presumption already that it's literalness, it's autobiographical nature, and I'm not taking away from the history of the black autobiographical genre in and of itself. Slave narratives and a whole host of autobiography. Of course, Malcolm X's is most kind of, evocative in a particular way. But to only see black art as purely being autobiographical or literal undermines its artistic and aesthetic power, right? Something that it's not allowed to have. So then therefore it's literal evidence in a courtroom trial. It's an admission of guilt or a manual, a criminal plan of what might happen, right? Even though the saying is the game is to be sold, not to be told, right? The idea that here these guys are making a plan about what they're going to do, right? I mean, there's a whole host of contradictions that this raises that hopefully we can get into, right? And so when the art form is seen as only literal and autobiographical and solely that, right? It begins to then speak about the assumptions around black bodies in the country itself, right? And so I want us to keep that in mind. And I think maybe one of the most damaging parts, right, I think, or destructive parts, and there's many, about this question about the admissibility of lyrics within courtrooms, to me, is the assault it has upon the legacy of critical race theory and critical race studies within the law, right? I mean, of course, that was influenced by Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Cheryl Harris, Richard Delgado, and a whole host of legal scholars, sought, and please forgive me, Professor Chemerinsky, for not doing this justice, but those who sought to see racism in a post-civil rights era in particular as systemic to the law. That even though de jure forms of racism were stripped off the law books, that means you can't segregate, there's no separate anything anymore. Race has been stripped out of the law. Critical race scholars argue that still systemically woven into the law is a white supremacist assumptions, set of white supremacist assumptions. And they sought to kind of unpack those. How? Through many means. But one of them, ironically, was the role of the personal narrative. Right? The personal narrative became a vehicle to potentially transform legal codes and assumptions. Yet here we are now talking about personal narratives reinscribing the racial hierarchies around black bodies in particular, right? The personal narratives of these rappers being brought into a courtroom, right? And in many ways, this is an assault on that legacy of critical race theory that sought to undo the racism woven into the fabric of the law, right? And I know I'm running out of time. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? I want to close, by talking about, while here we are talking about rap on trial, right? There's a whole host of examples within the history of hip hop, right? Where hip hop itself put the justice system on trial. It put America on trial, right? Very aware of its place within society, that in the post-civil rights era, right, that if we're going to understand the emergence of this phenomena that we're talking about, we have to understand it within the logic of the prison regime and mass incarceration, what Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow. We have to understand the emergence and normalization of the black criminal, post-black power, right, as a way of policing black bodies, and hip-hop emerges as a response specifically to that. So hip-hop is highly aware of its place within the culture. And there have been repeated attempts throughout hip-hop history to try and police black creativity. You see it through the way in which sampling and the sampling laws, and Graham is a graduate student here, right, who knows very well what I'm talking about as well, how sampling was policed. The idea of taking a snippet of a record and bringing it in and creating a new sound, right? How that policed and changed the way black creativity unfolded, right? But not just that, just its themes and its stories. And of course, the most kind of, maybe hopefully for some of you, it might be the year you were born, or maybe you were born even, after that, but NWA's, and pardon my language, Fuck the Police, that came out in 1988. Right? A song that drew the ire of the FBI. The FBI issued a memo to the record label and to all police departments. And when that NWA toured the country to perform, the police picketed, did not provide security. They couldn't get insurance to perform in certain venues because of that heat, right? There was a tremendous amount of kind of controversy around the song, as you can imagine. But, and this is what I'll close on. Too many people got caught up on the 3 words that were the title of the song. But they weren't really listening to what was happening in the song. I don't think. Because in the stuff I've read on it, that rarely comes out, if at all. If you listen to the song, how many people have heard the song? Okay. I mean, it was a lightning rod in early hip hop, 1988. It blew the doors off of, what was deemed acceptable. Hip hop prior to that had been, for the most part, an aesthetic convention. Rakim had kind of changed rhyme scheme and wordplay, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you started to see a shift based on Reagan-Bush politics, where an overt kind of politics, and NWA kind of embodied in many ways a street kind of politic that was challenging the experiences of black and brown men in the streets of Los Angeles, right? But if you listen to the song, and those of you who know, Dr. Dre, right, who now makes headphones, was the judge in that song. He's in charge of the court, right? And Eazy-E, NWA, and MC Ren, the other MCs in the group, right, testify and take the witness stand. And in each of their verses is their testifying and bearing witness to policing and its brutality. I didn't say police brutality, I said policing and its brutality. They testified on the stand in verse form. And so you saw in this song a very kind of creative and brilliant subversion of the power of the court and the legal frameworks that historically and in that contemporary moment had assaulted black bodies. But here you had young black men taking control of the levers of power and putting the police and the justice system on trial. Now, this is just one kind of more obvious example and maybe the most, compelling one. But there's a litany of those within the history of hip hop. Jay-Z, Scarface, Mos Def, a whole host of artists from the past to the present who have in many ways put America and the court, the so-called justice system on trial. And so I want everyone to be aware of that. And again, I think my time is up. Yeah. So I'm going to close at this point, but hopefully we can get into some more stuff during the Q&A. So thank you for your time.